All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. I think people will come in and join us, but we are going to be talking today about justice and advocacy. So it's session 5 in the books, but we're not really using the books a lot today. But you can read along if you want. But the discussion questions weren't as much this week as they have been some other times, so it's kind of more like introspective that we're going to talk about. So just less table talk, more internal talk. So justice and advocacy. So the reason that I signed up to teach this week is, I think some of you know that my first job out of law school was I was a prosecutor in Texas at the district attorney's office. And so the first thing in the Code of Criminal Procedure, which is the thing that governs how you try criminal cases in Texas, says it shall be the primary duty of all prosecuting attorneys, including any special prosecutors, not to convict, but to see that justice is done. And so that was a big deal, is that it's we're told that this is, kind of you get to wear the white hat. You are not just, the good guy putting people in jail, but you are the good guy who is supposed to be seeking and advocating for justice. And so that became, kind of a core thing to my career doing that, and just kind of a core thing. So seeing this about advocating for justice, I was like, perfect, this is all what I'm all about. So just kind of have that in the background of what is justice as we're talking about that. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of the difference between personal and structural sins and how justice applies to those. So personal sins are the things that we can think of pretty easily. So, and these were the things that I tended to be advocating against when I was a prosecutor. Excuse me. So they are things like theft, murder, sexual abuse, sexual misconduct, the things that are pretty easy to say, yes, that is against the laws of our state, our nation, often against the laws of Scripture. These are things that we should advocate against, and we should say, yes, these are wrong. Someone should go to jail for breaking them, or have some sort of consequence for breaking these. Any other ideas of personal sin that, there's lots of examples we can come up with, but personal sin.
These would be external personal sins.
Correct, but I think that's an important distinction. We all have internal personal sins as well, that maybe there's not somebody standing up telling a jury this person should go to jail for this, but we have those internal personal sins. That's a great point, and it's going to go into our next thing a little bit. So we have envy, we have lust, we have just all the different sins that we've talked about in the 10 Commandments, that Jesus talks about in Scripture, things just that we know are wrong, that are internal personal sins. Go ahead.
Scripture points out that they start inside and they eventually wind up that way if you don't stop.
Exactly, that's a great point. They start inside, then they go external, and then they go to structural or systemic sins.
Well, no, I was just saying agreements and contracts are huge areas of legal external sins. You broke a promise, you didn't deliver.
Right, exactly. It's and sometimes there's lying that's involved with that. There is,
failure to perform.
Correct. And they may not be a sin, failure to perform may not be a sin, but maybe there is the root cause, again, going back to the personal thing of the lying, the dishonesty, the greed, something like that leads to those things. So, but then we look at, so it all starts internal, right? It all starts with our internal personal sin. The things that are in our heart that may not come out externally, but it's still a sin. And so then we start from an internal personal sin, can become an external personal sin, but then we go to systemic sin, or social sin. And so these are the things that they arise from personal sin. So Sally made my point here. They arise from personal sin, but they become larger than just those things that we deal with internally, or even something that may be a crime that's easy to talk about. So examples that we have of this: slavery was a sin that was rooted in, or it became a systemic sin rooted in greed, rooted in pride, maybe things like that, but became a structural sin. Child labor in factories in like the 1920s, similar, has those things that, and again, may not even, and we'll talk about this, like it doesn't necessarily even start as something that is intentionally even a sin. It becomes like, or maybe it's like this is just the way it is, but sin enters in and perpetuates it. Unjust economic systems, debt culture that we'll talk about in a little bit. Overall distribution of wealth and poverty. How does personal sin play a role in that? Like with greed, again with pride and things like that. Unjust legal systems. Okay, let's go back to what I was just talking about, my career. Juries. We talked in an earlier session about how when Ben and I got married and I moved from Texas to Louisiana, Louisiana, up until the time right before we had children, still had a law on the books that you did not have to have a unanimous jury to convict people of a crime. You could only have, they only required 9 out of 12 people. And guess where that law came from? It came from Jim Crow days. And so it's because they wanted to make it, once Black people were able to start serving on juries, they still wanted to have it easier to convict people, particularly Black people. And so the way that they did that was, well, we're not going to say you have to have anyone unanimous. We're going to just say 9 out of 12 is good enough, supermajority. And so there became a time when people finally, and it was just kind of the, not questioned. And then became something that's like, finally became a constitutional amendment to the Louisiana state constitution saying we should require unanimous juries, at which point a lot of people were like, really, we still don't? But became an opportunity to say, yes, we need to change that.
Is that only in Louisiana? Are there other states?
There was one other state, which I think actually might have been Minnesota when I'm seeing your shirt. But there was one other state. Every other state, there were 48 states required unanimous juries, which is I think why it wasn't done. So it was Louisiana, one other state. Louisiana passed the constitutional amendment to overturn it, but I believe there was one other state that was still requiring it. I think that has since become federally constitutionally required because there was a Louisiana case that went up to the United States Supreme Court after the Louisiana law was changed. And so you have all of these people who were convicted under the non-unanimous jury system and now those convictions are now overturned because they're unconstitutional. And so I believe then once the U.S. Supreme Court decided that case, that it became mandatory throughout the country.
So did all those people have to get retried?
They did. So there was actually, it's been in the news recently, there was a New Orleans Saints football player, Will Smith, who was murdered in a road rage incident. It was a big deal in New Orleans. His murderer was only convicted originally 9-3, so non-unanimous jury, had to completely retry the case this past month, redo the thing, and he was convicted again with a unanimous jury. So yeah, there's a lot of maybe what feels like injustice of having to retry all those cases or say, okay, you've been in prison for this long, we'll just say, commute your sentence, you plead guilty to time served, things like that. But yes, so that opens up a larger discussion of justice, of what that means, for the victims, families, things like that. But came from this larger thing. So yeah, there's a lot that's involved in that. So what are the problems with these systemic sins that we talk about? So we all talked about, and again, this table does a great job of pointing out, all of these arise from our personal sin, right? Everything that happens in our world arises because we are sinful creatures, and so we have personal sin, and when you get a lot of sinners together creating, a world system, then we get systemic sin. Problem with most of these systemic sins too, they're legal. Slavery was legal. Child labor in factories was legal. Non-unanimous juries was legal. All of these things are legal. And so it's not as easy to advocate against them or even realize that they're unjust, because these other things, I was talking about these personal sins, that can then, some that we legislate and say these rise to the level of being crimes. Well, it's easy to stand up and say, the law says, I talked about the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. The other thing that has the laws in it is the Texas Penal Code. We have similar, statutes in every state that says, this is illegal. This is what our state will not tolerate. It is unjust for you to break these in so way. It's very easy to advocate and say, okay, you have broken the law, therefore you must be held accountable for that. But these things are legal. So it's really hard then to say, well, why should I question non-unanimous juries? It's legal. It puts bad guys in jail. What's wrong with it? But there is something that can be wrong with it in that overall system of justice. They can be subtle. We don't realize what's going on, especially if we benefit from it. Mm-hmm. Especially if we are the ones who are benefiting from these systems. So, thinking about child labor in factories, used to be over in these countries, or this country about 100 years ago, still going on elsewhere in the world, and still, allows us to have things that are cheap to buy. So something that's easy to look the other way for, things like unjust economic systems. If we are not feeling the impact of those, if we're doing well, and I think all of us in America are doing well compared to the rest of the world, we don't realize those because we benefit from them. And a lot of these, we just don't realize what's going on because they're just the fabric of life. And so we don't realize that they're going on, and we don't think about maybe they're unjust. But then we think about these can actually have a greater impact and hurt more people than our personal sins do. Because if we think about it, we were saying personal sins, a lot of times they're internal and they hurt my relationship with God. They hurt me. They may hurt my family if they come out, but they oftentimes stop there. And even when we think about some of those personal sins that go to hurting other people, even murder, like it hurts obviously a victim, it hurts a family, it hurts a community that's a larger group than that, but it's kind of localized. Some of these things, they hurt larger communities, they hurt nations. We're going to talk about distribution of wealth and poverty around the world can hurt a whole nation, and they can last for generations. We're still seeing the impacts of some of these things that are still playing out throughout the world of the impacts that these systemic sins that arise from our personal sins are having. There's a long tradition of God's people challenging political structures, and the book talks about this. So, first one we have Moses. What political structure did he challenge? Egypt, right? Pharaoh, the slavery of the Jews, again, legal basically at that point because Pharaoh said it was legal, but stood up, challenged that social system, freed the Jews because he followed God. Esther. Somebody read Esther 4:14. First of all, I guess giving context to that, what is the political structure that Esther is written in, or that she's dealing with?
She's under a king.
She's under a king. She's married to the king.
Discrimination against the Jews.
Discrimination against the Jews, right? And there's the whole book of Esther is talking about that a personal sin of Haman's pride being wounded turns into a systemic sin of now we're going to punish all of the Jews and make them be killed. And so then Esther, who is a Jew and is married to the king, has an opportunity to go talk to him on behalf of her people. And that's where we have Esther 4:14. Her cousin Mordecai is telling her about this.
For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
Right, exactly. Maybe God has put you in position for this. I love that it gets forgotten in that is that he's like, deliverance is going to come one way or another, whether it's through you or not. God is not limited by you, but maybe God has put you in power and in this position to challenge this political structure for such a time as this. Yes.
There's also the absolute power of a king. If he doesn't want you to say something,
Correct.
you're done.
Right, exactly. So this was, the picture of extending the scepter, and I remember being told, it's like, okay, and if he didn't extend the scepter, like, you could be killed right there, right? So she's doing this at great risk to herself. Next one is Amos, who preached against corruption in Israel. Can somebody read Amos 4:1-2?
I can.
Tom.
Listen to me, you fat cows living in Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and who are always calling to your husbands, bring us another drink. The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness. The time will come when you will be led away with hooks in your noses. Every last one of you will be dragged away like a fish on a hook.
So the book of Amos is really talking a whole lot about this idea of systemic justice and trying to undo a lot of things. There's a lot of talk about justice in Amos. And so in this verse, one of the things that the author of the book points out is he's like, we don't know that the women here who are oppressing the poor, we don't know that they are like, necessarily being the ones who are being cruel to the poor, that they are doing anything directly themselves to the poor people, but they are still benefiting from it. And so that even in that they will be held accountable, and that, it talks about that God's going to drag them out with fish hooks in their noses. It does not sound pleasant. So, that there's that, and again, the accountability that we have for both our individual things and the things that we participate in as well. William Wilberforce, who knows what he did?
Slavery in England.
Yeah.
Slavery in England, the transatlantic slave trade. Was a believer, I think a pastor in some ways, but it used his voice to start advocating for the transatlantic slave trade to be abolished in England, and eventually was successful in that. And used that, again, calling on scripture, calling on our tradition as Christians for that.
Amanda, he was in Parliament for over 50 years.
Okay.
Working towards that. And not long after it passed, he died.
He died, yeah. There's a great movie about it.
Yeah.
What's it called? Amazing Grace, yeah.
Yes.
It's wonderful, and it's heart-wrenching just to see what he's doing and just to see the sacrifice that he personally made to change something. And he was, member of parliament. He was kind of almost like a one-issue candidate of and the only thing he was doing was talking about abolishing the slave trade. I'm sure he did, many other things as well, but that was his main job in life, was to talk about that. So other recent examples, Martin Luther King. So this is a picture that I took. I got to visit the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. In November. It is. I saw it at night, which is really powerful. I'm sure it's powerful in the day, but at night was really powerful as well. The statue of Dr. King looks weird in pictures, but when you see it in person, it's like his eyes follow you. And so it's just very convicting in a lot of ways. And so around that, they have walls that have different quotes from his life. And so this one says, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy." So again, kind of that call to kind of stir ourselves up and think about what are the things that are going on that maybe I'm comfortable with, I'm not realizing there, but starting to have that question. And also, what am I going to do if there are challenge and controversy? What am I going to do with that? So which brings us to our next example, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was in South Africa during apartheid. And so these are two quotes from him. The first one, which kind of goes along with what Dr. King said, of if you're neutral in situations of oppression, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. I will say with that, I think it's a very powerful quote. I think in our modern age of social media, I think that there can be this can be taken out of context and be said, everyone has to have an opinion about something and you have to tell us that. Like I know, for example, after the Israel-Hamas war started, that there were people calling on celebrities, and it's like, and using this quote or some version of it, and it's like, if you have not issued a statement on Twitter, then we are going to assume you are with the evil ones, whichever side they define evil to be, that you are on the wrong side. There's even been calls I've seen that if Taylor Swift called for a ceasefire, we would achieve peace in the Middle East. It is legitimate, people are saying this. So put grains of salt all over this. But what I would say with this is, remember the context of this is, that, in situations of oppression, it became, again, apartheid was one of those things, kind of like slavery, kind of like Jim Crow, of like, it was just kind of the way things were, but then people started to realize, why is this happening? Why are we doing this? And so it became clear this is not something we should tolerate anymore. And I think we can acknowledge that there was a lot of room for gray and for different, particularly in really complex things like peace in the Middle East, and things like that there was a lot of room for gray, and not everything is black and white. And so the important thing is then to be listening to those who are telling us their experiences, and to listen to those. I think we've seen some of that just in different situations where maybe there's an initial reaction of, no, that can't be true, whether I'm thinking of some of the, racial injustice things that have happened in our country in the past couple of years, some of the things that have been coming out of Israel and Gaza, and originally kind of like the first instinct is, no, that couldn't be happening. And then when you listen and continue to hear the stories, it's like, oh, well, maybe now let me think about this. Let me think about what I'm hearing from the people who are experiencing this. Let me listen. And so I think that is important, that listening is not necessarily being neutral and passive. And so that can be the first step in our advocating for things, is to listen to those who are telling us something and who maybe are advocating for something, is to at least just hear their stories. Which goes to our second quote. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they keep falling in. And I think this is a really big point of, again, context. Looking at what is the larger picture, what's going on there that we should be asking about. Great example of this, we're pulling people out of the river. Again, I'm from Texas. There were literally people being pulled out of the Rio Grande River at the Texas-Mexico border every day. And we are pulling them out of the river. A lot of them are, some are being brought up here, they're being treated in we can do things for refugees, and we do a great job here of supporting organizations that help refugees. We do that. Can be a lot of debate about how do we handle the people who are being pulled out of the river, but what about this point about we need to go upstream and find out why they keep falling in, or why they keep willingly going in Central America and South America?
Well, it could be like the situation of homelessness.
Exactly.
Oh, well, just because you didn't try and everything. Well, there's a lot more
Right.
to what led them to that.
Exactly. It's a great point. And so I think that the thing in this is that we can do both and. We can help those who are homeless, we can help them individually, we can help organizations that help them, but then we can also look back at what are the situations that led them to that? Is there substance abuse? Is there mental health things that need to be dealt with? Are there family situations?
Or systemic, like they can only get a job for $14 an hour.
Right.
And their rent is
Exactly.
basically 90% of that.
Exactly. Or even some of the barriers to housing, to homeless shelters, that there can be costs associated with having to go to a homeless shelter, or barriers of you can't have pets, things like that. So yeah, let's look at the questions of why are those situations happening? What can we do maybe to address some of those larger situations? I think that there are great organizations that work with those who are homeless to deal with mental health issues, to establish low barrier shelters, things like that. And also to go to some of the systemic issues. What if it's because rent is too high and we're not, we're inadvertently putting up a systemic barrier to them getting housing anyway? I think we see that a lot with people who are living in their cars and things like that. May not be the people on the streets, but they're still homeless. So things like that can be, and again, zooming out from what we see and listening to people who are telling us who are experiencing that themselves or who work with those who experience it. And what are they telling us? Listening to the people who know that. So another recent example, this is the one that the book talks about, is Jubilee 2000. Was anyone familiar with this movement? Okay, so what happened was that this is prior to the year 2000, so pre-Y2K. I don't think we have anyone in this room that was foreign to, and if we're gonna have some college students, that was, gonna be a little bit before their time. But so the problem was that you have these governments of poorer nations, particularly the global South, and they owed billions of dollars to governments of wealthier countries, particularly the G8 countries, the World Bank, and those countries tended to be in the global North. And so as a result, the governments couldn't provide basic necessities for their citizens because all of their money that they took in was going to pay off debt and interest, or a very large portion of that was paying off debt and interest to these wealthier countries. And so then there became this advocacy that started when people were hearing about these issues and why are these situations happening in these countries. And they started the Jubilee 2000 petition. So back in the year 2000, way long time ago, the Catholic Church specifically made a big deal about 2000 was going to be the year of Jubilee. And just like that we hear about in the Bible is going to be, we're going to release debts, we're going to have freedom, this is the year of Jubilee, and it's 2000, it's a big time, we're going to experience that. So, some Christians said, let's do this beyond just the church context, and let's bring it into a global context. And they started a petition to say, we want to have the UN, the World Bank, these wealthier nations release the debt, and particularly the interest, because we know that's always where the main issue comes with repayment, right? And it keeps adding up. Let's release the debt of these poor countries. And so this petition was led by Christians. They got over 24 million signatures to this petition from people from over 60 countries. And the result was over $130 billion of debt was canceled. And so what that meant was, just looking at some of these countries, and so the story in the book is about an individual girl in a village, and so her village finally got public health centers fully stocked with medicine. Schools grades 1 to 7 were free for the first time. They finally had access to clean water. But then in other places in Africa, 1.5 million children in Uganda returned to school after the government eliminated the school fees. 500,000 children in Mozambique received vaccinations. Free healthcare was provided for millions living in rural areas in Zambia, many of whom had never had access to any form of modern healthcare before. 2,500 new primary schools were created and 28,000 extra teachers were trained, resulting in 98% of Tanzanian children being able to enroll in primary education. So you think about what is the change that happens in all these nations, in these children, and what does that mean for generations, their children's children and their children's children's children, because of the healthcare, the clean water, the schooling and the education that they were able to get. And again, that just started from, obviously $130 billion is a big deal, but started from a petition from people listening and hearing the stories of those who say, and it goes back to that question of why are they getting in the water in the first place? Let's not just send money to help them. Why do they need help in the first place, or send people to help them or send supplies? Why do they need this in the first place? And they found out it's because the government can't pay for clean water. They can't pay for schools or making us pay for schools because all of the money they get is basically going to pay on interest on these debts that we have. So again, it comes from like the listening to the people experiencing it, and then advocating, just a simple thing of petitions and talking to members of parliament and Congress and things like that in over 60 countries to get this debt canceled. And then we see the impact that it had. So the next thing we're going to do is I want to look at this verse in James. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do, and fails to do it commits sin. And so thinking about, and I think again, there's this important phrase, anyone who knows the right thing to do. And going back to that, being silent in the face of injustice, and we don't have to have opinions and statements on everything. But what do we know in our own lives? What are the things that we can question, things that we see that are things that it's like, that's not right. For me, once I found out Louisiana had non-unanimous juries, and I'm a former prosecutor who used to have to get a unanimous jury, I'm like, okay, this is not okay. We need to change the law. And even though thankfully there actually was not a lot of opposition to this, there were a few prosecutors who, Louisiana does not have a similar requirement, who said like you're gonna let bad guys go and things like that. But just said, this is something that is important to justice. We had a professor in law school who used to say, there's some things that are more important than catching criminals. And kind of this is a big enough deal that, now that I know that this is happening and I think this is wrong, I need to start saying something about it and telling people about it. And then just that we have a reminder as Christians when we're talking about our personal sin and institutional sin, systemic sin, that it's once we know about it, we know about the systemic sin, systemic injustice, that if we don't do something about it, we don't advocate for it, we don't change in our own world, the Bible tells us that that's back to personal sin for us. That it's our job and our call, because God cares about justice, cares about those who are victims of injustice, that we are supposed to do something about it. So, thinking about what injustices do you see in your areas of life that need advocacy? So for example, I am obviously really passionate about things having to do with the criminal justice system, because I was a part of that. But there can be a lot of things that you may experience that are dealing with healthcare that I don't know about because I'm not in that world. And you can know that. Or things that you see and you know better because you've been a missionary and you know what life is like for in different countries and what people are dealing with there, that they can deserve advocacy for here, for things that we can do to change situations there. So what we're going to do for the majority of the rest of our time is we're going to watch a video that is actually from one of Ben's and my law professors. And he was a federal prosecutor back in the 80s and 90s. And ever since then, since he's gone to academia and things like that, his life's work has become working on changing the federal sentencing guidelines, dealing with the disparity, and he'll explain this in the video we're going to watch, between powder cocaine, which is usually used by white people, and crack cocaine, which is generally thought to be used by black people, and just that currently, or not currently, it's been changed, but the law for the longest time was that it was 100 times harsher for crack cocaine than for powder cocaine. So 100 times harsher for black people than for white people. And so his life's work now, he's been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court in a footnote. He was doing this when we were his students, is advocating for that to be changed. And then he's working on clemency, so dealing with, kind of like we talked about, when those cases that were sentenced under the old laws and trying to change those. So I want you to hear his story. He was an advocacy professor, so he's very good at this. But hear it and think about, as you're listening, what are situations that I experience in my life that I'm aware of, either in my work, the things that I deal with, that need advocacy like this, and also just to hear from what are other things that are happening. So